A skinny boy shouted to the truck driver, "Your brake is damaged, don't go." Nobody took it seriously, until a man ran away. The next day, when the truck driver returned, he couldn't hold back his tears. Malik wiped the sweat off his forehead, his fingers scraping the brim of his old cap. The sun was relentless, beating down on the dry, cracked ground of the small gas station. His mother was inside, standing behind the counter, her eyes tired as she stacked a few dusty bottles on the shelf. Malik watched her through the window, noticing the way she paused every few seconds to rub her back. The worn-out fan above her barely moved the heavy air. He kicked a small rock along the edge of the gas station lot, keeping his eyes on the trucks rolling by on the road. Most of them didn't stop, but every now and then, one would pull in for fuel or a quick rest. Malik liked those moments. It broke the monotony. He would help his mother carry items out or clean windows for the drivers. Sometimes they'd toss him a coin, which he would pocket, hoping someday to buy something nice for his mom. Today, though, it was quiet. Too quiet. His mom had been talking about how few customers they had lately. Bills piling up. Not enough people stopping by. Malik had heard it all, the tension making its way into their small, one-bedroom home at the edge of town. He wandered around the back, near the fuel tanks, playing with an old stick. He swung it at an imaginary foe, making swishing noises as he sliced the air. The stick cracked in half, and Malik tossed it aside, sighing. He bent down to pick up a small rusted bolt from the ground, turning it over in his hands, when he heard a sound that caught his attention. A truck rumbled up, parking close to the pump. Malik stood up straight. It was Mr. Davis. He recognized the man by the bright red cap he always wore, sitting high on his head. Mr. Davis waved, and Malik waved back, giving a small smile. He liked Mr. Davis. He was friendly, always bought a soda, and sometimes told Malik about his travels. Malik began to walk towards the pump to see if Mr. Davis needed any help, but something made him stop. A movement out of the corner of his eye. Near the back of the truck, there was a man, someone Malik didn't recognize. He wore a dark jacket, even in this heat, which seemed odd. He was crouched down by one of the truck's massive tires. Malik frowned, narrowing his eyes. The man looked around like he was checking if anyone was watching. Malik ducked behind a rusty barrel, his eyes peeking over the edge. The man's hands were on the brake lines. Malik could see him twisting something, his movements quick, nervous. The man kept looking back toward the station, his eyes shifting. Something wasn't right. Malik could feel his stomach twist. He knew enough about trucks to know brakes weren't something to mess with, not like that. His mouth felt dry, and he swallowed hard, trying to decide what to do. His heart thudded in his chest, and his palms felt sweaty against the edge of the barrel. Mr. Davis had just walked into the small convenience store, greeting Malik's mother. He had no idea what was happening outside. Malik wanted to yell out, but his voice felt stuck in his throat. What if he was wrong? What if he caused trouble for nothing? But the way the man moved, the way he darted his eyes, it didn't feel right. Malik forced himself to move, his legs feeling heavy. He stood up, his heart racing, and took a deep breath. He stepped out from behind the barrel, taking a few quick strides toward the truck. "Hey! Hey, mister!" Malik shouted, his voice cracking. He pointed toward the man at the back of the truck. The man looked up, his eyes wide. For a second, Malik thought he might stay and try to explain himself. But then the man bolted. He took off across the open lot, his feet kicking up dust as he ran toward the dry scrubland beyond the station. Malik's eyes followed him for a moment, then turned to Mr. Davis, who had come running out of the store at the sound of the commotion. "Malik, what's going on?" Mr. Davis called, his face full of confusion. Malik pointed to the back of the truck, his voice rushed, almost stumbling over the words. "That guy, he was messing with your brakes. I saw him. He ran that way." Mr. Davis's expression changed, his eyes going wide. He rushed to the back of his truck, dropping to his knees to check the brake lines. Malik watched as his fingers moved along the tubing, then heard him swear under his breath. Mr. Davis stood, dusting off his knees, his face pale. "Kid, you might have just saved my life," he said, his voice serious, eyes locking onto Malik's. Malik felt his chest tighten, a mix of relief and fear. He didn't know what else to say. People had begun gathering now, other drivers and a few folks who were nearby. They crowded around asking questions, their voices blending into a loud hum. Malik felt smaller and smaller with each one. "Who was that guy?" someone asked. "Did you know him?" Another voice came, louder this time. Malik just shook his head, stepping back, his back pressing against the side of the gas pump. He didn't know the man. He didn't know why he'd done it. All he knew was that something had been wrong, and he'd acted. Now, with everyone staring at him, he almost wished he hadn't. Mr. Davis put a hand on his shoulder, a reassuring squeeze. "You did good, Malik. You really did." Malik tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The crowd's voices still buzzed around him, and he felt a sense of unease settling deep in his gut. He had done the right thing, but why didn't it feel good? Malik watched as Mr. Davis knelt down beside his truck, checking the brake lines carefully. The crowd had thinned a bit, but some people were still standing around, muttering to one another, pointing at the truck, at Malik. His mother came rushing out of the store, her eyes wide with worry, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's going on?" she called, pushing her way through. She saw Malik standing there, his face pale, and her expression softened. "Malik, are you okay?" she asked, her hand reaching out to cup his cheek. Malik nodded, but his throat felt dry. He could feel all the eyes on him, people waiting for an explanation. He shifted from one foot to the other, looking down at the ground. His mother turned to Mr. Davis, who was still inspecting the truck. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and confusion. Mr. Davis stood up slowly, dusting his knees off again. He looked at Malik, then back at Malik's mom. "Your boy here, he just saved me from something real bad," Mr. Davis said, his voice steady. He pointed to the brake lines. "Someone messed with my brakes. If I'd left without knowing, I could have been in serious trouble." Malik's mother's eyes widened, and she pulled Malik closer to her side, wrapping an arm protectively around his shoulders. She looked at him, her face softening, and she brushed a hand over his hair. "You did that, Malik?" she asked quietly. Malik nodded again, not trusting himself to speak. His heart was still pounding, his head spinning. He didn't like all this attention. He didn't like the way people were looking at him, like he was some kind of hero. He had just done what felt right. Mr. Davis looked at the crowd, his face serious. "Whoever that man was, he wanted to hurt someone," he said loudly, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "This boy stopped that from happening. Y'all should be thanking him." There was a murmur of agreement, a few nods. Someone patted Malik on the shoulder, and he felt the weight of their hands. He wanted to disappear. His mother seemed to sense that, and she pulled him closer, giving Mr. Davis a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I think we should get inside. It's been a long day." Mr. Davis nodded, giving Malik a smile. "You take care, kid. You did good." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled bill, and handed it to Malik. "For the trouble." Malik looked at it, then up at Mr. Davis. He took the money slowly, mumbling a thank you, then turned and let his mother lead him back into the store. The crowd began to disperse, people returning to their cars, their conversations fading into the background. Inside, the air was cooler, the sound of the old fan whirring above them. Malik's mother knelt down in front of him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you okay?" she asked again, her voice gentle. Malik swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'm fine, Mama," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She pulled him into a hug, holding him tight. Malik closed his eyes, feeling the tension in his body start to loosen. His mother pulled back, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "You scared me," she said, her voice trembling a little. "But you did a brave thing." Malik shrugged, looking down at the floor. I saw him. I knew it wasn't right." His mother nodded, giving him a sad smile. "Sometimes doing the right thing is scary," she said. She stood up, her hand resting on his shoulder for a moment before she moved behind the counter. "Why don't you sit down for a bit, all right? I'll finish up here." Malik nodded again, moving to sit on the small stool behind the counter. He watched his mother as she went back to stocking the shelves, her movements slower now, her eyes flickering back to him every few moments. He could still feel the fear in his chest, the way his heart had pounded when he shouted. The way the man had looked at him before he ran. It was like Malik could still feel his eyes, watching, waiting. The bell over the door jingled, and Malik looked up, his body tensing for a moment. But it was just another driver, a man in a dusty shirt and a tired look. Malik watched as his mother greeted the man, her voice steady, her smile small but kind. He tried to relax, tried to let himself feel proud of what he had done. But it was hard. The fear was still there, sitting in his chest, making it hard to breathe. The rest of the day passed slowly. The sun dipped lower in the sky, the heat finally starting to ease. Malik helped his mother close up the shop, his eyes darting to the window every few minutes, watching the road. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man might come back, that he might be waiting out there, somewhere. "Malik," his mother said, her voice pulling him back. She was standing by the door, her hand on the light switch. "Come on, let's go home." Malik nodded, grabbing his cap from the counter and pulling it down low over his eyes. He followed his mother out, locking the door behind them. They walked across the lot, their footsteps crunching in the gravel. Malik glanced back at the road, the empty stretch of asphalt fading into the distance. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the fear. They walked in silence, the air cooling as the sun dipped below the horizon. Their house wasn't far, just a small building on the edge of town. Malik could see the lights already on in the window, a soft glow against the dimming sky. His mother unlocked the door, letting them both in, and Malik kicked off his shoes, dropping down onto the old couch. His mother sat beside him, her hands resting in her lap. "Malik," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes tired. "I know today was hard, and I know you're scared, but you did the right thing." Malik swallowed, looking down at his hands. "What if he comes back?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. His mother was quiet for a moment, then she reached over, taking his hand in hers. "If he comes back, we'll deal with it," she said. "You're not alone, Malik. We'll be okay." Malik nodded, squeezing her hand. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to feel safe, but the fear was still there, a heavy weight in his chest. He looked at his mother, her eyes tired but steady, and he tried to smile. "All right, Mama," he said, his voice a little stronger. "I'll try." His mother smiled, leaning over to kiss his forehead. "That's all I ask, my boy. Now get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." Malik nodded, standing up and heading to his small room. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He moved to his bed, lying down and staring up at the ceiling. The day played over in his mind, the stranger's face, the sound of his mother's voice. Malik closed his eyes, trying to push it all away. Eventually, sleep found him, the fear easing just enough to let him rest. Malik woke up early, the light just starting to filter through the small window in his room. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, the events of the previous day coming back to him all at once. The man by the truck, the running, the way people looked at him. He took a deep breath and pulled his cap off the bedpost, settling it on his head before pushing himself up. He could hear his mother in the kitchen, the clinking of plates and the sound of the old kettle whistling. Malik stood, stretching, then opened his door and walked down the narrow hallway. His mother looked up from the stove as he entered, her face softening into a smile. "Morning, Malik," she said, her voice gentle. "I made some eggs. Sit down." Malik nodded, pulling a chair out at the small table. He sat, his hands resting in his lap, watching as his mother set a plate of eggs in front of him. She leaned against the counter, her eyes on him. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice quiet. Malik shrugged, picking up his fork. "I'm okay, I guess," he said, though he wasn't sure it was true. He still felt that tightness in his chest, the unease that had followed him since yesterday. He forced a small smile, looking up at her. "I just don't like everyone looking at me." His mother sighed, crossing her arms. "I know, sweetheart," she said, "but you did something good. People noticed. It'll pass." She paused, her brow furrowing a bit. "Just be careful, all right? Keep your eyes open. If you see anything strange—" "I know, Mama," Malik interrupted, nodding. "I will." His mother gave him a sad smile, then turned back to the stove. Malik took a bite of his eggs, but he could hardly taste them. He kept thinking about the man, about the way he had looked at him before he ran. Malik wasn't sure he could just forget about it. He had a feeling that the man wouldn't forget about him either. Later that morning, Malik walked with his mother back to the gas station. The sun was already high, the heat baking the earth beneath their feet. Malik kept his head down, his eyes on the gravel, but he could still feel people looking. A neighbor waved at them, and Malik's mother waved back, but Malik just kept walking. When they reached the station, Malik went inside while his mother opened up. He grabbed a rag and started wiping down the counter, trying to keep himself busy. The bell over the door rang, and Malik looked up, his heart skipping a beat. It was Mr. Davis. "Morning, folks," Mr. Davis called out, giving Malik a nod. He looked a bit more relaxed today, his red cap sitting comfortably on his head. Malik's mother greeted him, and Mr. Davis walked over to the counter, leaning on it. He looked down at Malik, his eyes kind. "How are you doing, kid?" he asked, his voice gentle. Malik shrugged, looking away. "I'm okay." Mr. Davis nodded, then lowered his voice a bit. "I know it's a lot, what you did. It's not something most people would have had the guts to do." He paused, waiting until Malik looked up. "But I want you to know, you did the right thing. And if you need anything, you let me know, you hear?" Malik nodded, managing a small smile. "Thanks, Mr. Davis," he said. Mr. Davis smiled back, then straightened up. He turned to Malik's mother. "I'll just take a soda today," he said, pulling some coins from his pocket. Malik's mother nodded, moving to the cooler to grab a bottle. As Mr. Davis left, Malik felt a little of the tightness in his chest ease. It was nice having someone like Mr. Davis say those things. It made Malik feel like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The day moved on slowly, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the heat pressing down on the station. Customers came and went, most of them just passing through. Malik stayed busy, carrying small items to people's cars, wiping down windows. He was glad for the distraction, anything to keep his mind off yesterday. But not everyone was kind. As the afternoon dragged on, a man pulled up in an old, battered truck, his face lined and grumpy. He stepped out, his eyes flicking to Malik, and he sneered. "So you're the kid everyone's talking about, huh?" the man said, his voice rough. Malik paused, unsure of how to respond. He nodded, feeling his cheeks flush. The man shook his head, laughing under his breath. "Just got lucky, didn't you? That's all it was. A little kid getting in the way. Don't think you're some kind of hero, boy." Malik looked down, his heart sinking. His mother, hearing the man, stepped out from behind the counter, her eyes flashing. "That's enough," she said sharply. "He's just a boy, leave him be." The man shrugged, his face twisted into a smirk. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," he muttered, turning back to his truck. Malik watched him go, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mother put her hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "Don't listen to him, Malik," she said, her voice low. "He doesn't know anything." Malik nodded, but the words still stung. He could feel tears pricking at his eyes, but he blinked them away. He wouldn't let that man see him cry. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. As the sun began to set, Malik and his mother closed up the station, the quiet settling over them like a heavy blanket. Malik felt exhausted, his body aching from the long day. He walked beside his mother, their footsteps slow, the heat finally starting to fade. His mother looked over at him, her eyes soft. "You did well today, Malik," she said, her voice gentle. "I know it's hard, but you're strong. I'm proud of you." Malik nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mama," he said. When they got home, Malik went to his room, sitting down on his bed. He pulled his cap off, tossing it onto the pillow. He could still hear the man's voice in his head, the way he had laughed, the words he had said. Malik took a deep breath, trying to let it go. But it was hard. The fear was still there, the unease, the feeling that things weren't finished. Malik knew the man who messed with the truck hadn't been caught. He knew that meant there was still a chance he'd come back. And that thought made it hard for Malik to relax, even as the house grew quiet, even as the night settled in. His mother called from the other room, telling him dinner was ready. Malik stood, brushing his hands over his jeans, then walked out of his room, forcing himself to smile as he sat at the table. His mother gave him a knowing look, her eyes kind. "Tomorrow will be better," she said softly, handing him a plate. Malik nodded, hoping she was right. He ate slowly, the food warm and comforting. His mother talked about her day, her voice steady, a soothing presence in the small room. Malik listened, letting her words wash over him, the fear slowly starting to loosen its grip. That night, after dinner, Malik lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. He thought about the man in the dark jacket, the way he had looked at him before he ran. Malik knew he might never forget that look, the coldness in his eyes. But he also knew that he had done the right thing, even if it was scary, even if people doubted him. Malik closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He would keep his eyes open. He would stay alert. And he would protect his mother, no matter what. The next day came, and with it, a sky as clear as glass and the usual sweltering heat. Malik could already feel the sun burning against his skin as he walked with his mother back to the gas station. The dusty road stretched out in front of them, quiet except for the crunch of their shoes on the dry earth. Malik kept his eyes ahead, his mother walking beside him with the same determined stride as always. When they arrived, the station looked as it always did. A few empty pumps, the convenience store with its crooked sign, and a few scattered pieces of trash fluttering in the dry breeze. Malik took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. He followed his mother inside and helped her open up, flipping the sign on the door and turning on the lights. Malik tried to focus on his tasks, sweeping the floor, arranging the shelves. But every time a truck rumbled by, his head snapped up, his heart pounding in his ears. He kept expecting to see that man again, the one who had messed with the brakes. He kept expecting something to happen. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing did. Customers came and went, the day stretching on slowly. A few drivers nodded at Malik, some even smiled, but none of it made him feel any better. He could still feel the weight of everyone's expectations, the way people looked at him like he was different now. It wasn't a good feeling. Around midday, Mr. Davis pulled in again. Malik saw the truck before he saw the man, recognizing the bright red cap through the windshield. He felt a little flicker of relief, his shoulders relaxing just a bit. Mr. Davis parked and got out, waving at Malik. "Hey there, kid," Mr. Davis called, a smile on his face. Malik nodded, trying to smile back. Mr. Davis walked over, giving Malik's mother a polite nod before turning back to Malik. "How are things today?" he asked, his voice kind, but Malik could hear the concern underneath. "Okay, I guess," Malik said, shrugging. He looked down at the ground, kicking at a pebble. Mr. Davis frowned slightly, leaning down so he could meet Malik's eyes. "You still worried about what happened?" he asked, his voice low so his mother wouldn't hear. Malik hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," he admitted. "I keep thinking maybe he'll come back." Mr. Davis sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Listen, Malik, you did something real brave," he said. "But I get it. I get why you're scared. That fella, he was bad news. But people like that, they don't like attention. He knows folks around here are watching for him now." Malik looked up, meeting Mr. Davis's eyes. "You really think he won't come back?" Mr. Davis nodded, his expression serious. "I really do. And if he does, well, you just tell someone. You've got people here who'll look out for you." Malik swallowed, nodding slowly. "Thanks, Mr. Davis," he said quietly. Mr. Davis smiled, giving Malik's shoulder a light squeeze. "Anytime, kid. Now you keep your chin up, all right? You're tougher than you think." Mr. Davis bought a soda and a snack, then headed back out to his truck, giving Malik a wave before driving off. Malik watched until the truck disappeared down the road, the tension in his chest easing just a bit. He turned back to the store, where his mother was watching him with a small smile. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her eyes soft. Malik nodded, managing a real smile this time. "Yeah, Mama, I'm okay." The rest of the day passed uneventfully. The sun climbed higher, then slowly began to dip, the shadows growing longer. Malik stayed busy, helping customers, cleaning up around the store. He could feel the unease still there under the surface, but it wasn't as sharp as before. Maybe Mr. Davis was right. Maybe everything was going to be okay. As the sun started to set, a familiar truck pulled up to the station again. This time, it wasn't Mr. Davis. It was the old battered truck belonging to the man who had made fun of Malik the day before. Malik felt his stomach twist, his hands tightening around the rag he'd been using to clean the counter. The man stepped out, his face just as grumpy as before. He walked into the store, his eyes locking onto Malik immediately. Malik looked away, pretending to focus on the counter, but he could feel the man's stare. "Hey, kid," the man said, his voice rough. Malik looked up, forcing himself to meet the man's eyes. The man smirked, shaking his head. "Still thinking you're some kind of hero?" Malik didn't say anything, just stared at the man, his jaw clenched. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, the way his face flushed hot. The man stepped closer, leaning over the counter. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You think people care about what you did? They don't. They forget real quick. You're not special." Malik opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He just stared at the man, his hands shaking slightly. Before he could do anything, his mother stepped out from the back, her eyes narrowing when she saw the man. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold. The man straightened up, giving her a lazy smile. "Just getting some gas," he said, then turned and walked out of the store. Malik watched him go, his chest tight, his heart pounding. His mother came over, putting her hand on his shoulder. "Don't let him get to you, Malik," she said, her voice soft. "He doesn't know anything." Malik nodded, but he could still feel the sting of the man's words. He tried to push it down, to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. He took a deep breath, looking up at his mother. "Let's close up, Mama," he said quietly. She nodded, giving him a small smile, and they started closing the store, turning off the lights and locking the doors. As they walked home, the sky darkening around them, Malik stayed quiet. His mother kept glancing at him, but she didn't say anything. She knew him well enough to know when he needed time. When they got home, Malik went straight to his room, sitting down on his bed. He pulled his cap off, turning it over in his hands. He could still hear the man's voice, the way he had laughed at him, the way he had tried to make him feel small. Malik took a deep breath, trying to let it go, trying to remember what Mr. Davis had said, that he was brave, that he was tough. His mother called from the other room, telling him dinner was ready. Malik stood, putting his cap on the bedpost and heading out to the small kitchen. His mother was already sitting at the table, her eyes soft as she watched him. "Come sit, sweetheart," she said, patting the chair beside her. Malik nodded, sitting down. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of their forks on the plates. Malik's mother looked at him, her eyes full of worry. "You know, people like that man. They're just unhappy with themselves," she said softly. "They want to make others feel small because they feel small." She reached over, touching his hand. "But you don't need to listen to him, Malik. You're better than that." Malik looked at her, his eyes stinging a bit. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thanks, Mama." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "Anytime, my boy. Now eat up. Tomorrow's another day, and you need your strength." Malik nodded, picking up his fork. He still felt the weight of everything that had happened, the fear, the anger. But he also felt his mother's hand, the warmth of her touch, the steadiness in her voice. And that helped, more than anything else. That night after dinner, Malik lay in bed staring up at the ceiling. He thought about the man at the station, the way he had tried to tear him down. But then he thought about Mr. Davis, about his mother, about the way they had stood by him. And he knew that was what mattered. Not the people who tried to make him feel small, but the ones who lifted him up. Malik closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He would keep his head up. He would stay strong. And he would make sure his mother was proud of him, no matter what. Malik woke up the next morning feeling a little different. There was still a knot in his stomach, but it wasn't as tight as it had been. He took a deep breath, letting the morning light fill his small room, and put on his old cap. The day ahead still held a sense of uncertainty, but he was determined to face it. He walked into the kitchen where his mother was already making breakfast. She glanced at him, smiling softly. "Morning, sweetheart," she said. "Eggs again. We'll get by until payday." She tried to keep her tone light, but Malik could hear the worry beneath it. "Morning, Mama," Malik said, nodding. He pulled out a chair and sat down, watching her move around the cramped kitchen. He wanted to help somehow. He'd always wanted to, but today it felt different, more urgent. They finished breakfast in silence, and as they walked back to the gas station together, Malik tried to think of a way to help his mother. He kept thinking about Mr. Davis, about how he had offered to help if Malik ever needed anything. Maybe there was something he could do with that money, something that would make things easier for his mother. When they got to the station, Malik slipped inside, going straight to the shelves. He started organizing them, keeping himself busy, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. The day began as usual, quiet, slow, with the sound of trucks rumbling in the distance. Malik kept himself moving, rearranging, sweeping, anything to distract himself. By late morning, Malik heard the familiar rumble of a truck pulling up to the pumps. He looked out the window, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the bright red cap of Mr. Davis's truck. Malik hurried outside, waving at Mr. Davis as he stepped down from the cab. "Hey, kid," Mr. Davis said, smiling. "How's it going today?" Malik tried to smile back. "All right, I guess," he said. He hesitated, then stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. "Mr. Davis, can I ask you something?" Mr. Davis's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. He nodded, leaning down so Malik wouldn't have to speak so loud. "Sure thing, Malik. What's on your mind?" Malik took a deep breath, looking down at his shoes. "I was wondering about the money you gave me. Could I maybe use some of it to help my mom? We're having a hard time with bills and everything. I want to help her." Mr. Davis's face softened, and he put a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Of course you can, kid. That money's yours to do whatever you need with, and I think helping your mom is a real good thing to do." Malik nodded, his chest feeling a little lighter. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. I really appreciate it." Mr. Davis smiled, ruffling Malik's hair beneath his cap. "You're a good boy, Malik. Your mama's lucky to have you. Now why don't you head back inside? I've got a couple of things I need to buy." Malik nodded, running back inside to get the register ready. Mr. Davis came in after a moment, his hands filled with snacks and drinks, setting them down on the counter. Malik rang him up, the bell on the register giving a cheerful ding as he counted the coins Mr. Davis handed over. "Hey, Malik," Mr. Davis said, leaning on the counter, his eyes serious. "I've got something else for you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope, and handed it to Malik. Malik blinked, staring down at it, then up at Mr. Davis. "What's this?" Malik asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Just a little extra," Mr. Davis said, giving him a kind smile. "You saved my life, kid. I don't know how else to thank you. You take this, and you use it for whatever you need. For you, for your mama. It's yours." Malik opened the envelope slowly, his fingers trembling. His eyes went wide when he saw the money inside, more than he had ever seen in one place. He looked up at Mr. Davis, his eyes stinging. I don't know what to say." Mr. Davis smiled, patting Malik on the shoulder. "You don't need to say anything, Malik. Just take care of yourself and take care of your mama. That's all I ask." Malik swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaky. "Really?" Mr. Davis nodded, then straightened up, tipping his cap to Malik's mother as she stood in the back of the store watching. "Y'all take care now," he said, then turned and walked out, climbing back into his truck. Malik watched him drive away, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands. His mother walked over, her eyes wide as she looked at the envelope. "What's that?" she asked softly. Malik handed it to her, watching as she opened it, her eyes widening even more. She looked at Malik, her mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. Malik smiled a little, his eyes still stinging. "It's for you, Mama. To help with the bills. Mr. Davis gave it to us." His mother blinked, tears filling her eyes. She reached over, pulling Malik into a tight hug, her arms trembling around him. "Oh, Malik," she whispered, her voice thick. "You're such a good boy. I don't know what I did to deserve you." Malik hugged her back, his eyes closing. "You deserve everything, Mama," he said softly. "I just want to help." His mother pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked down at the envelope, then back at Malik, her smile shaky but genuine. "We'll use this for the bills," she said. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll get ourselves a little treat too. You deserve that." Malik smiled, nodding. "Okay, Mama." The rest of the day felt different. The weight that had been sitting on Malik's chest seemed lighter, the tightness easing. He felt like he had done something good, something real. And as they worked through the day, he could see the change in his mother too. The way her shoulders weren't as tense, the way she smiled more easily. It made everything feel worth it. But not everyone shared in their happiness. The man from the day before came back in the afternoon, his old truck rattling as he parked it by the pumps. Malik's stomach twisted when he saw him, his eyes narrowing slightly as the man got out and walked into the store. The man looked around, his eyes landing on Malik. He sneered, shaking his head. "So, heard you got yourself some money," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Guess you got lucky again, huh?" Malik clenched his jaw, trying to keep his face neutral. His mother stepped up beside him, her eyes cold as she looked at the man. "You need something?" she asked, her voice sharp. The man shrugged, looking around the store. "Just here for some gas," he said lazily. He looked back at Malik, his eyes narrowing. "But I'll tell you this, kid. Luck doesn't last forever. You remember that." Malik didn't say anything, just stared at the man, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mother put her hand on his shoulder, her grip firm, and Malik felt a little of the tension leave his body. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to look away from the man. The man left without buying anything, climbing back into his truck and driving off, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Malik watched him go, then looked up at his mother. She smiled at him, her eyes soft. "Don't let him bother you, Malik," she said. "He's just a bitter old man." Malik nodded, taking another deep breath. "I know, Mama, I hate the way he talks." His mother nodded, squeezing his shoulder. "I know, sweetheart, but you're better than him. Don't let his words bring you down." Malik nodded, giving her a small smile. "Okay, Mama." That night, after they closed up the station, Malik and his mother walked home, the envelope of money tucked safely in her bag. Malik felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew things weren't perfect. There were still bills to pay, still worries to face. But for now, they had a little bit of relief. And that was enough. When they got home, Malik's mother made them dinner, something simple but warm and comforting. They sat together at the small table, eating in silence for a while. Then, his mother looked at him, her eyes soft. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "maybe we could use a bit of that money for something special, just for us. What do you think?" Malik looked at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, Mama," he said. "I think that sounds nice." His mother smiled, nodding. "Good. We deserve a little happiness, don't we?" Malik nodded, his heart feeling full. "Yeah, we do." That night, as Malik lay in bed, he thought about Mr. Davis, about the way he had helped them. He thought about the man in the dark jacket and the fear that still lingered in the back of his mind. But most of all, he thought about his mother and the way she had smiled today, the way her shoulders had seemed lighter. And he knew that whatever happened, he would keep doing whatever he could to make her happy. The next morning felt a little different. Malik woke up to a sense of hope, even though the room was still the same as always, small, cluttered, with that familiar yellow light spilling through the cracked window. He pulled on his cap and stood in front of the mirror for a second, staring at himself. He was still just Malik, but he felt like he was standing a little straighter today. When he got to the kitchen, his mother was already cooking, humming softly under her breath. There was a new lightness in her face, a hint of ease that hadn't been there before. Malik could feel it, like a warmth spreading through the house. He sat at the table, smiling at his mother as she served breakfast. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice brighter. "We've got a little extra today, eggs and some toast." Malik looked down at his plate, noticing the extra piece of toast, and he couldn't help but grin. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Morning, Mama," he replied, taking a bite and savoring the small difference. They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy. It felt good, comfortable. They walked to the gas station together, the air already warming up as the sun began to rise higher. Malik held his head a little higher today, and his mother seemed to walk with more ease. As they neared the station, Malik noticed someone leaning against one of the pumps. A man, one of the regulars, stood there, arms crossed, watching them. "Morning," Malik called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't respond right away, just kept looking at them. Malik felt a twist in his stomach. "Morning," the man said eventually, his tone flat. He looked at Malik, his eyes narrowing a bit. Heard you got some reward money. Malik paused, glancing at his mother. She put a hand on his back, giving him a small nudge. Malik swallowed, nodding. Yeah, Mr. Davis helped us out. The man shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. Ain't that something? Just for shouting out about some breaks, huh? I guess luck's a funny thing. Malik felt his face grow hot. His mother stepped forward, her eyes hard. He did the right thing, and Mr. Davis wanted to thank him. It's as simple as that, she said, her voice sharp. The man shrugged, his smile turning into a smirk. If you say so. Just don't let it get to your head, kid. He turned, walking away towards his old car, leaving Malik and his mother standing by the pump. Malik felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding. He looked down at the ground, his fingers curling into fists. Why do they all think that, Mama? He whispered. Why do they think I didn't deserve it? His mother sighed, pulling him into a gentle hug. People talk, Malik. They don't understand what it took for you to do what you did. They don't know the fear you felt, or the courage it took to act. They just see what they want to see. Malik nodded, his throat feeling tight. I hate it. I hate how they look at me. His mother pulled back, her eyes meeting his. You can't let their words define you, Malik. You know what you did, and I know what you did. That's all that matters, and we're going to be okay because of you. Malik took a deep breath, nodding slowly. Okay, Mama, he said. They opened up the station, and Malik threw himself into the day's work, doing his best to push the man's words out of his head. He swept the floor, cleaned the windows, helped customers carry their things. He kept busy, kept moving. It was the only way to keep the thoughts from creeping back in. By midday, Malik was exhausted, his legs aching from moving around the station non-stop. He took a moment to sit on the stool behind the counter, leaning back and letting out a long breath. His mother looked over at him, her eyes soft. Take a break, sweetheart, she said, her voice gentle. You've done enough for now. Malik nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He was about to head outside for some fresh air when he heard the familiar sound of a truck pulling in. He looked out the window and saw the red cap of Mr. Davis. Malik felt a little flicker of relief and stood up, heading to the door to greet him. Hey, Mr. Davis, Malik called out as Mr. Davis climbed down from the truck, giving Malik a big smile. Hey there, kid. How are things today? Mr. Davis asked, his voice cheerful. Malik shrugged, trying to smile back. All right, I guess, he said. Mr. Davis's smile faded slightly and he looked at Malik, his eyes narrowing. Something wrong? He asked, his tone serious. Malik hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Some people, they don't think I deserve the money, he admitted. They think I just got lucky. Mr. Davis frowned, shaking his head. Well, those folks don't know what they're talking about, he said. You did something real brave, Malik, and I wanted to thank you for it. That's all there is to it. Malik nodded, his chest feeling a little lighter. Thanks, Mr. Davis, he said softly. Mr. Davis smiled, reaching into the back of his truck and pulling out a small box. Hey, I've got something for you, he said, holding it out to Malik. Malik blinked, taking the box and looking up at Mr. Davis, confused. What's this? He asked. Just a little something, Mr. Davis said, his smile widening. Open it. Malik opened the box, his eyes going wide when he saw what was inside. It was a model truck, painted bright red, just like Mr. Davis's. Malik looked up at Mr. Davis, his mouth opening in surprise. I painted it myself, Mr. Davis said, his voice a little shy. Figured you might like it. Malik swallowed, his eyes stinging. He looked down at the truck, then back up at Mr. Davis, a smile spreading across his face. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling. It's amazing. Mr. Davis nodded, looking a little embarrassed. You're welcome, kid. You've earned it. He patted Malik on the shoulder, then turned back to his truck. Now, I've got to get back on the road. You take care of yourself, all right? Malik nodded, clutching the model truck to his chest. I will, Mr. Davis, thank you. Mr. Davis climbed back into his truck, giving Malik one last wave before driving off. Malik watched until the truck disappeared down the road, then looked down at the model truck in his hands, a smile still on his face. He walked back into the station, holding the truck carefully. His mother looked up, her eyes going wide when she saw it. What's that? She asked, her voice full of surprise. Mr. Davis gave it to me, Malik said, his voice soft. He painted it himself. His mother smiled, her eyes shining. That's wonderful, Malik. You deserve it. Malik nodded, setting the truck on the counter and looking at it for a long moment. He still felt the sting of the man's words from earlier, but now, looking at the truck, he felt something else too. He felt proud. Proud of what he had done. Proud of the way he had helped. And he knew, deep down, that his mother was right. He couldn't let other people's words define him. He knew what he had done, and so did the people who mattered most. And that was enough. That evening, after they closed up the station, Malik and his mother walked home together, the sun setting behind them. Malik held the model truck in his hands, turning it over and admiring the bright red paint. He looked up at his mother, a smile on his face. Hey, Mama, he said, his voice a little hesitant. I was thinking, maybe we could use some of that money to get you something too. Something nice. His mother looked at him, her eyes softening. Oh, Malik, she said, her voice trembling. You don't need to worry about me. Malik shook his head. I want to, Mama. You do so much for me. I want to do something for you, too. His mother smiled, her eyes filling with tears. She reached over, pulling Malik into a hug. You're such a good boy, Malik, she whispered. I'm so proud of you. Malik hugged her back, his heart feeling full. I just want to make you happy, Mama, he said. She pulled back, wiping her eyes and giving him a shaky smile. You already do, sweetheart. Every single day. That night, as Malik lay in bed, he looked at the model truck on his nightstand, the bright red paint catching the moonlight. He thought about the people who doubted him, the ones who tried to tear him down. But he also thought about Mr. Davis, about his mother, about the people who believed in him. And he knew that was what mattered. Malik closed his eyes, a sense of peace settling over him. He had done something good, and no one could take that away from him. The next morning started like any other, with the sun already blazing through Malik's window by the time he was awake. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and looked over at the small model truck on his nightstand. The bright red paint glistened in the light, and Malik felt a small smile tug at his lips. He reached over, picking it up, and turned it over in his hands. Mr. Davis had painted it with care, each detail considered, each brushstroke precise. Malik knew exactly what he wanted to do today. He wanted to make something for Mr. Davis, a gift that showed his gratitude. The truck had been so much more than just a toy. It had reminded Malik that people believed in him, and he wanted to return that feeling. He put the model truck back on his nightstand and quickly got dressed, slipping his cap on as he headed to the kitchen. His mother was already up as usual and had a small breakfast waiting for him, some toast and a cup of tea. Malik sat down, giving her a smile. Morning, Mama. Morning, sweetheart. She looked at him as she poured herself some tea, her eyes bright. You look like you've got something on your mind today. Malik nodded, taking a sip of his tea. I want to make something for Mr. Davis, a gift, to say thank you. His mother smiled, sitting down across from him. That's a lovely idea, Malik. What are you thinking of making? Malik thought for a moment. tapping his fingers against the edge of his cup. I was thinking, maybe a keychain, something small that he could keep with him. His mother nodded, her smile widening. I think that's perfect. Something he can carry on the road. She paused, looking around. I think there's some wood out in the back shed you could use, and I might have some paint somewhere. Malik's heart lifted and he grinned. Thanks, Mama. He quickly finished his breakfast, the excitement already buzzing through him. His mother stood, giving him a gentle pat on the back. Go on, sweetheart. I'll see what I can find, she said, her voice warm. Malik rushed outside, heading to the small shed behind their house. It was dusty and cluttered, full of old tools and scraps. He rummaged through the shelves until he found a small piece of wood, about the size of his palm, and smiled. It was perfect. He picked it up, brushing off the dust, and headed back inside. His mother had found some old paints, mostly leftover colors from when they'd painted their small kitchen years ago. Malik looked at the selection: red, black, white. He smiled, nodding to himself. It was enough. He set himself up at the kitchen table, spreading out the supplies. His mother watched from the counter as she cleaned up from breakfast, her eyes soft. Malik worked slowly, carving the small piece of wood into the shape of a truck. It was rough, his hands trembling a little as he worked, but he kept at it, determined. Hours passed, the sun moving across the sky, but Malik didn't stop. He sanded down the edges, making it as smooth as he could. He carved small lines for the windows, the doors. His mother brought him lunch at some point, but he barely noticed, too focused on his work. Once he was satisfied with the shape, he picked up the paintbrush, dipping it into the red paint. He worked carefully, painting the small truck, making sure each stroke was smooth. He added the black for the wheels, a small bit of white for the windows. When it was finally done, he leaned back, looking at it, a smile spreading across his face. His mother walked over, looking down at his work. She smiled, her eyes filled with pride. That's beautiful, Malik. Mr. Davis is going to love it. Malik nodded, his chest swelling with pride. He picked up a piece of string, tying it to the top to make a small loop, turning it into a keychain. He held it up, letting it dangle in the light, the red paint shining. It wasn't perfect, there were still rough edges, and the paint had smudged a little, but it was his, made with care. He set it down to let the paint dry, his hands aching from the hours of work. His mother made them both a cup of tea, and they sat together at the kitchen table, the keychain resting between them. You know, his mother said, her voice soft, this is more than just a thank you. It's a way of showing that you care, that you value what Mr. Davis did for you. Malik nodded, looking down at the keychain. I want him to know. He didn't have to help us, but he did. His mother smiled, reaching over to brush his hair back from his forehead. And that's why this is perfect, because it comes from your heart. The next day, Malik woke up feeling both excited and nervous. He picked up the keychain from the table where it had dried overnight, holding it carefully in his hands. Today, he was going to give it to Mr. Davis. He hoped Mr. Davis would like it, that he'd see the care Malik had put into it. Malik and his mother walked to the station together, the keychain tucked safely in Malik's pocket. The day began like any other, slow, with only a few cars stopping by. Malik kept looking out at the road, waiting for Mr. Davis's truck. Each time he heard the rumble of an engine, his heart would jump, but it wasn't him. His mother watched him, her eyes knowing. She gave him a small smile as she restocked the shelves. He'll come, sweetheart. Don't worry. Malik nodded, trying to relax, but the nerves stayed with him. He kept his hands in his pockets, his fingers brushing against the keychain, feeling the rough edges of the wood. He wanted this to go well. He wanted Mr. Davis to know just how much his help had meant. Finally, in the late afternoon, Malik heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the deep rumble of Mr. Davis's truck. He looked up, his heart pounding, and saw the bright red cap through the windshield. Malik felt a rush of both excitement and anxiety as he stepped out of the store, waving at Mr. Davis as he parked. Mr. Davis climbed out of the truck, smiling when he saw Malik. "Hey there, kid. How are things today?" he called out. Malik took a deep breath, walking up to Mr. Davis, his hand still in his pocket. "Hey, Mr. Davis," he said, his voice a little shaky. I made something for you." Mr. Davis blinked, his smile fading into a look of surprise. "You did? Well, let's see it." Malik pulled out the keychain, holding it out to Mr. Davis, his hands trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. So, I made this for you." Mr. Davis took the keychain, staring down at it for a long moment. Malik held his breath, waiting. Then, Mr. Davis looked up, his eyes wide, a smile spreading across his face. "Malik, this is amazing," he said, his voice filled with emotion. He turned the keychain over in his hands, his fingers brushing over the painted wood. "You made this all by yourself?" Malik nodded, his face flushing. "Yeah, I wanted you to have something. To remember." Mr. Davis looked at Malik, his eyes shining. He reached out, pulling Malik into a hug, his arms strong and warm. "Thank you, kid," he said, his voice a little shaky. "This means more to me than you know." Malik hugged him back, a smile spreading across his face, his chest feeling light. He pulled back, looking up at Mr. Davis. "I'm glad you like it." Mr. Davis nodded, his smile wide. He took out his keys, attaching the keychain to them, letting it dangle from his hand. "I'm going to carry this with me everywhere, Malik. You're a good kid, you know that?" Malik's smile widened, his eyes stinging a bit. "Thanks, Mr. Davis." Mr. Davis patted Malik on the shoulder, then turned to his truck. "I gotta get back on the road, but I'll see you soon, all right? And thank you again." Malik nodded, stepping back as Mr. Davis climbed into his truck, the keychain hanging from the ignition. Malik watched as the truck pulled away, his heart feeling full, the sun setting behind it. He turned, walking back to the station, where his mother stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with pride. She smiled at him, her voice soft. "You did good, Malik." Malik nodded, his heart still light, the anxiety gone. "Yeah, Mama. I think I did." The morning sun was just starting to climb over the horizon as Malik sat on the small bench outside the gas station, his eyes fixed on the distant road. He was waiting for Mr. Davis again, feeling a strange combination of anticipation and nervousness. He had already given Mr. Davis the keychain, but something inside him wanted to see his reaction after some time had passed. Did he still keep it on his keys? Did he actually use it? His mother stepped out of the store, her hands dusted with flour from the morning's inventory. She looked at Malik and smiled softly. "You're waiting for Mr. Davis again, aren't you?" she asked knowingly. Malik looked up, a little sheepish, and nodded. "I guess. I just want to see, you know." His mother sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked over and sat beside him on the bench, her arm brushing his shoulder. "You've already done more than enough, Malik. Whatever happens now, you have to let go of those worries. You made something from your heart, and Mr. Davis knows it." Malik nodded, trying to take her words to heart. But the nervous energy remained. It wasn't just about the keychain, it was about everything. The people in town, the stares, the whispers. He wanted proof that what he had done mattered, that he wasn't just some lucky kid, like the others said. They sat in silence for a while, watching the dust dance in the sunlight. The road remained empty, stretching into the horizon, until finally, Malik heard the sound of an approaching truck. He knew that sound by now, the deep rumble, the distinct thrum of an engine that had driven so many miles across the desert. Malik stood, squinting against the sun as the familiar red cap came into view. It was Mr. Davis. He felt his heart pick up, his nerves sharpening into focus. His mother stood up beside him, giving him a gentle nudge on the shoulder. "Go on, Malik," she said softly. Malik took a deep breath and stepped forward as the truck pulled up beside the pumps. Mr. Davis climbed out of the cab, the bright red cap sitting proudly on his head. He looked over and spotted Malik, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Well, if it isn't my favorite kid," Mr. Davis called out, his voice booming. He waved, and Malik found himself smiling back, the nerves starting to ease. "Hey, Mr. Davis," Malik called, walking over. Mr. Davis looked down at his keys, and there it was, the little red truck keychain dangling in the sunlight. Malik felt a rush of warmth in his chest, his worries starting to melt away. Mr. Davis must have noticed him staring, because he held up the keys, letting the keychain sway in the air. "You see this, Malik? I told you I'd carry it everywhere." "And I meant it," Mr. Davis said, his smile warm and genuine. Malik looked at the keychain, the bright red paint catching the sun. He smiled, his eyes stinging a little. "I'm glad you like it, Mr. Davis," he said, his voice a little thick. Mr. Davis nodded, his expression softening. He leaned down, resting a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You know, Malik, not everyone out there has the guts to do what you did, and even fewer have the heart to give something back after. You're one in a million, kid." Malik swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. He nodded, blinking back the tears that had started to gather in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Mr. Davis stood up, looking back at his truck for a moment before turning back to Malik. "I've got something for you too, actually. Wasn't planning on giving it to you today, but since I'm here..." He turned and reached into the cab of his truck, rummaging around for a moment before pulling out a small box wrapped in brown paper. Malik blinked, looking at the box, his curiosity piqued. Mr. Davis handed it to him, his smile widening. "Go on, open it." Malik took the box carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He peeled back the paper, his fingers trembling slightly, and opened the lid. Inside was a small pocket knife, the handle carved with intricate designs. Malik looked up at Mr. Davis, his mouth open in surprise. "It's not much, but I figured it might come in handy for a young man like you," Mr. Davis said. "And don't worry, I made sure it's safe for a kid your age. Just promise me you'll be careful with it, all right?" Malik nodded, speechless. He turned the knife over in his hands, the metal glinting in the light. He had never owned anything like it before. He looked up at Mr. Davis, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. I'll take good care of it, I promise." Mr. Davis smiled, his eyes twinkling. "I know you will, kid." He patted Malik on the shoulder, then turned back to his truck. "Well, I better get on my way. I've got a long haul ahead of me today. But you take care, Malik. And remember, you've got folks around here who care about you." Malik nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "You too, Mr. Davis. Drive safe." Mr. Davis climbed back into his truck, giving Malik one last wave before he pulled away from the pump, the engine rumbling as he headed back down the road. Malik watched until the truck disappeared from sight, the smile still on his face. He turned back toward the gas station, the pocket knife still held tightly in his hand. His mother was waiting in the doorway, her eyes soft as she looked at him. "What did Mr. Davis give you?" she asked, her voice curious. Malik held up the knife, the designs carved into the handle catching the light. "A pocket knife," he said, his voice still filled with wonder. "He said it might come in handy." His mother walked over, taking the knife from his hand and inspecting it. She looked at Malik, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You know you have to be careful with this, right? It's not a toy." Malik nodded, his expression serious. "I know, Mama. I'll be careful. I promise." His mother smiled, handing the knife back to him. All right, just make sure you keep that promise. She ruffled his hair, her touch gentle. Now let's get back to work. We've still got a station to run. Malik nodded, slipping the knife into his pocket. He followed his mother back inside, the weight of the knife a comforting presence against his leg. He felt different now, more confident, more sure of himself. He knew he still had a long way to go, but today he had taken another step forward. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Malik worked alongside his mother, sweeping the floors, restocking the shelves, helping customers. He kept his hand on his pocket every now and then, just to feel the knife there, a reminder of Mr. Davis's words. Later that evening, after they had closed up the station and were walking home, Malik looked over at his mother. She seemed tired, her shoulders slumping a little, but there was still a lightness to her step that hadn't been there before. Malik took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Mama," he said, his voice soft. "I know I can't do everything, but I promise I'm going to keep trying to help. I want things to get better for us." His mother looked over at him, her eyes filled with emotion. She stopped walking, turning to face him, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Oh, Malik," she whispered, her voice thick. "You're already doing more than enough. You're my strength, sweetheart. Just knowing you're here, just knowing you're trying, that's all I need." Malik swallowed, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. He nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I just want to make you proud, Mama," he said, his voice cracking. His mother pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "I'm already so proud of you, Malik," she said, her voice a whisper against his ear. "Every single day." They stood there for a long moment, the desert wind brushing against their faces, the sky growing darker around them. Malik closed his eyes, letting himself lean into his mother's embrace, feeling the warmth of her love wrap around him like a shield. When they finally pulled away, his mother smiled at him, her eyes shining. "Now let's get home," she said, her voice light. "I think we deserve a little treat tonight." Malik smiled, nodding. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the stars just starting to appear in the sky above them. Malik felt a sense of peace settle over him, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would still be people who doubted him, still be struggles to face. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The morning air was cool as Malik sat on the small bench outside their home, the sky just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He took a deep breath, feeling the crispness in the air. Today felt different. There was something about the early morning that made him feel lighter, like anything was possible. He had the pocket knife with him, the weight of it resting comfortably in his pocket. He pulled it out, turning it over in his hands, the designs catching the faint light. The knife wasn't just a tool, it was a reminder of what Mr. Davis had said, of Malik's courage, of his worth. It was something he needed to hold on to, especially on days like today when he felt the world pressing down on his shoulders. He heard the door behind him creak open, and his mother stepped out, her eyes still sleepy, but her smile warm. "Up early again?" she asked, her voice soft. Malik looked up at her, nodding. "I like the mornings," he said. "It's quiet." His mother smiled, walking over and sitting beside him on the bench. She looked out at the horizon, the colors just starting to bloom in the sky. "Quiet can be good," she agreed. "Gives you time to think." Malik nodded, his fingers tracing the carvings on the knife's handle. He was quiet for a moment, then looked at his mother. "Mama, do you think things will ever change? I mean, really change?" His mother turned to look at him, her eyes filled with that same gentle warmth. She reached over, resting her hand on his. "I think they already have, Malik," she said. "Maybe not in big ways, maybe not enough for the whole world to see. But here, with us, Things are different, and that's enough for me." Malik looked down at the knife, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I guess you're right," he said softly. "It does feel different." His mother squeezed his hand gently, then stood up, brushing off her apron. "Come on, let's get ready for the day. We've got a station to open and people to help." Malik nodded, standing and slipping the knife back into his pocket. He followed his mother down the dusty road, the sun rising behind them, casting long shadows across the ground. The gas station was quiet when they arrived, just the way it always was at this time of the morning. Malik walked inside, flipping on the lights, the hum of the old fluorescent bulbs filling the space. He started his usual routine, sweeping the floor, wiping down the counters, restocking the shelves. His mother moved through the store, humming softly under her breath, the sound comforting in the quiet morning. It was the same routine, but somehow it felt different today. Malik could feel it, a new sense of purpose, a feeling that he was where he needed to be. As the morning wore on, a few cars rolled in, each one greeted by his mother's warm smile. Malik helped carry bags, cleaned windshields, and made small talk with the customers. He could feel the looks from some of them, the curious glances, the way they seemed to be watching him more closely. He knew the story of what he had done had spread, and he tried to focus on the good that had come from it, not the whispers and the doubts. Around midday, a familiar old truck pulled up to the pumps and Malik's stomach twisted. It was the same man who had sneered at him before, the one who had said Malik didn't deserve the reward. Malik watched as the man climbed out of his truck, his face as sour as ever. He walked over to the pump, glancing at Malik, then turned his gaze away, like Malik wasn't even there. Malik took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. He knew he couldn't let the man's words get to him, not today. He watched as the man filled his tank, his expression cold, then walked toward the store. The bell above the door rang as the man stepped inside, and Malik's mother greeted him as warmly as she did every other customer. Malik stayed back, watching as the man bought a few snacks, tossing them on the counter with a scowl. His mother rang him up, her voice polite but distant. The man looked over at Malik as he waited for his change, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Still hanging around here, huh?" he muttered, just loud enough for Malik to hear. Malik felt his jaw tighten, the words cutting into him. He wanted to say something back, wanted to tell the man that he didn't know anything about him, about what he'd done. But before he could speak, his mother's voice cut through the air, clear and firm. "My son has more courage than most men I know," she said, her eyes locking onto the man's. "And he's more than earned his place here. If you can't see that, then you don't know him at all." The man's face flushed, his mouth opening as if to argue, but he quickly closed it again. He took his change, muttered something under his breath, and walked out of the store, slamming the door behind him. Malik watched him go, his chest tight, his heart pounding in his ears. His mother turned to look at him, her eyes softening, and she gave him a small smile. "You don't need to listen to people like that, Malik," she said, her voice gentle. "You know who you are, and so do I." Malik swallowed, the tension easing a little, and nodded. "Thanks, Mama," he said quietly. She walked over, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. Malik closed his eyes, letting himself relax into her embrace. He knew she was right. He couldn't let the words of people like that man define him. He had done something good, and he knew that. He had helped Mr. Davis, and he had helped his mother, and that was enough. The rest of the day passed quietly, the sun beginning to set as they closed up the station. Malik felt a sense of calm settle over him, a feeling that things were finally starting to fall into place. He walked home beside his mother, their shadows long in the fading light. When they got home, Malik sat down on the small bench outside, watching as the sky turned from blue to a deep, rich orange. He pulled the pocket knife from his pocket, turning it over in his hands. He thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the doubts, the moments of courage. He thought about the way Mr. Davis had smiled when he gave him the keychain, the way his mother had stood up for him in the store. Malik knew that things weren't perfect. There were still struggles ahead, still people who wouldn't believe in him, who would doubt what he had done. But he also knew that there were people who mattered, people like his mother, like Mr. Davis, who saw him for who he really was, and that was enough. He looked up as his mother stepped out of the house, a small plate of food in her hands. She sat down beside him, handing him the plate, her eyes soft. "Thought you might want a little something before bed," she said. Malik smiled, taking the plate. "Thanks, Mama." He took a bite, the warmth of the food filling him. They sat together in silence for a while, watching as the first stars began to appear in the sky. His mother looked over at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "You know, Malik," she said, her voice soft, "no matter what happens, you've already made me prouder than I ever thought possible." Malik looked at her, his heart swelling. "I just want to keep making you proud, Mama," he said. She smiled, reaching over to brush his hair back from his forehead. "You already do, sweetheart. Every single day." Malik looked out at the horizon, the stars blinking into view one by one. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. The future was still uncertain, still full of challenges he couldn't predict. But for the first time in a long time, Malik felt ready for whatever came next. He knew who he was. He knew what he was capable of. And he knew that no matter what anyone said, he had the courage to face whatever lay ahead. Malik smiled, leaning back on the bench, the pocket knife resting in his lap. The world around him was still the same, dusty, quiet, full of unknowns. But for Malik, something had shifted. The fear that had once held him back was fading, replaced by something stronger. Hope.